look, we're not going to avoid all failure, but we can decrease the probability of failure, which is really all any leader can hope to do, is just not screw up quite as much or quite as badly. And that can be helped with a president who's paying attention, who's organized his White House not around a continual series of message events, but who's organized his White House around, or her White House, around actual governing.
It is my pleasure to present tonight's talk with Elaine C. Kamarck, discussing her book, Why Presidents Fail and How They Can Succeed Again. Elaine C. Kamarck is a senior fellow in the Government Studies program at the Brookings Institution and is a lecturer at Harvard Kennedy School. The focus of her research is on the American presidential nomination system, and she has worked as an advisor on a number of presidential campaigns.
The thesis here is quite simple, and this is a quite short but straightforward book. The bottom line is, it's my contention that modern presidents have lost the ability to govern because they have paid so much attention to communicating and having wonderful speeches and et cetera, that they don't pay enough attention to the government that they run. And then when the government that they run blows up on them, they discover that all of their high-paid speechwriters and message people can't save them from the disasters that then occur. And so, and this has happened, by the way, through presidents, Democrats and Republicans, so I'm not making a partisan statement here. In fact, what the book does is it goes through several case studies. I'm not sure they're page turners, but that was awfully nice of them to say. I start with one in the Carter administration, which some of you with gray hair here may remember, which was the failure in Jimmy Carter's administration to rescue the Iranian hostages. I then talk about the three failures in the George W. Bush administration: the failure to foresee 9/11, the failure of the war in Iraq, and the failure to foresee both the financial crisis and the Hurricane Katrina response. I then go on to talk about the disasters in the Obama administration, the websites that didn't work after he put up his signature domestic policy plan, and the failures at the Veterans Administration that caused him such ongoing problems and such a disaster. And the contention in each of these, I won't take you through them, but because I want you to read the book, of course, but the bottom line in each of these is that while a lot of times these big failures are seen as like bad luck, right, and acts of God, there are things that, if you're paying attention to the government that you're running, that are knowable. And in each of these instances, there were things that were knowable, and they had to do, however, with the boring business of organizational capacity. A term that is a business term, right? But it's absolutely apropos of government, too. People have to figure out, can this organization do what I'm expecting it to do, what I'm going to ask it to do? And it's my contention, and I make this case throughout the book, that presidents just have gotten to a point where they talk a lot and they govern a little. And because of that, they miss the critical issue of organizational capacity. So let me read you a little anecdote from one of the later chapters that I think captures this. Whenever America gets a new president and a new vice president, a team of government workers in the General Services Administration is responsible for taking down photos of the outgoing president and vice president and putting up photos of the incoming team. While the rest of the country is digesting the election results and slowing down for the holidays, this team is working overtime. They must get official photographs taken of the two new leaders, have them reproduced in the thousands, and then make plans to put them up in 8,603 government offices in the United States, approximately 250 embassies and consulates, and between 500 and 1,000 U.S. military installations, depending on what's going on in the world, around the world. This is no small undertaking, as the switch must be accomplished in a short amount of time from just before to just after noon on Inauguration Day. But the symbolism is immense. On the day after Inauguration Day, approximately 2.7 million civilians and 1.5 military personnel, uniformed military, who work for Uncle Sam come to work. The claims adjuster at the Social Security office in Rochester, New York, the deputy chief of mission in Tirana, Albania, the forest ranger at Yellowstone National Park, the biologist at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, and the soldiers stationed in Stuttgart, Germany, all see the same thing when they arrive: their new boss. They may not have voted for this man or woman. In fact, they may hate him, his team, and his party, but they all know who the boss is. And they have all entered government service knowing that whether they like it or not, they work for the president. Now, let's go over to the White House on the morning after Inauguration Day. A tired and perhaps slightly hungover president and vice president get to work. There are a lot of new people around who work for them. Most of them, however, are in military uniform. They open the doors, fly the helicopter, man the watch on the guns that sit on top of the White House. What these new employees do not actually do is talk to the president. In fact, on that morning after the inauguration, the people most likely to talk to the new president are the same ones who have been talking to him for the past 2 years, the close campaign advisors. There will be some new faces. Every morning, the CIA sends over someone with a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist to present the president's daily brief, a compilation of the most sensitive goings-on collected overtly and covertly from around the world by American spies. Some of these spies are undercover and are probably the only federal employees who don't walk into an office on the morning after Election Day and see photos of the new president and vice president. But most of the people the president sees every day will be the same people he saw when he was campaigning. So it's this mismatch, okay? Very few presidents come into office with a sense of the magnitude of the government that they run. Now, this government spends more money each year than the top 25 Fortune 500 companies, and it has more employees than the top 6 employers in the United States. Okay, it's a gargantuan enterprise. The thing to realize about something this big is that at any given point in time, something is going very right and something is going very wrong. Okay? I mean, literally at the same point in time. So let me read you another short piece here. It's from a chapter I call Spacewalks and Crashing Websites. On December 21st, 2013, 2 Americans, Michael S. Hopkins and Richard A. Mastracchio, you probably know who they are, don't you? Detached tubing and electrical connectors from a malfunctioning cooling pump. This may sound very ordinary until you realize that the 2 Americans were astronauts, and the cooling pump they were fixing was part of the International Space Station 240 miles above the Earth. During their 5.5-hour spacewalk, they wore suits designed to protect them from the lack of oxygen, the freezing temperatures, and the cosmic dust that make space an inhospitable place for humans, to say the least. 2 months earlier, on October 1st, 2013, millions of Americans in search of subsidized health insurance logged on to the new federal website, healthcare.gov, hoping to buy insurance as easily as they could buy a plane ticket on Expedia.com or a book on Amazon.com. Or so they thought. Instead, to the dismay of the Americans shopping for health insurance and to the surprise of President Barack Obama and his top staff, the websites crashed. Not once, not twice, but again and again and again over a period of months. The press erupted in a frenzy over the inability of the federal government to build the website at the heart of the healthcare reform. They were joined by a polarized citizenry, half of whom wanted to buy health insurance and were endlessly frustrated, and half of whom saw the whole episode as yet more evidence that the government couldn't organize a two-car funeral. The pundits pounced, opining that the federal government couldn't do technology, that government was hopelessly broken. And yet no one seemed to notice that the technological marvel of men walking in space to repair a space station was accomplished in exactly the same manner in which the healthcare.gov website was built. Federal bureaucrats at NASA, the space agency, contracted with a wide variety of companies, from a little-known company here in Massachusetts that made the spacesuits, to Boeing, the aerospace giant that designed and built some of the most sophisticated components of the space station. In another part of the government, the one dealing with healthcare, federal employees at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, had contracted with information technology companies in the private sector to build the infamous websites. The success of the spacewalk passed with little notice. While the failure of the healthcare.gov website ruined President Obama's Christmas, that's for sure, pushed his approval ratings to new lows, and convinced Americans ready to be convinced that Obama and the government he was in charge of were hopelessly inept. And so that's kind of an example of the need for presidents to get a handle on what this government is. They don't do that these days. President Obama came right here to Boston just days after the website debacle. And some of us were just shaking our heads and saying, honey, you cannot talk your way out of this one. When presidents have these big, big failures, the helicopters crashing in the desert, the failure in Hurricane Katrina, et cetera, you can't talk your way out of it. I mean, everybody sees, whoops, that is not working. And so my plea in this book, and I'll do this in just a couple of minutes at the end, is that presidents need to spend less time talking, more time governing. And I propose that in two ways. First of all is a little wonky, okay? That is that I think the White House needs to have a vast expansion of what has traditionally known as the Office of Cabinet Affairs. Bob Reich, who an old Bostonian, Bob Reich wrote a book many years ago called Locked in the Cabinet. And it was a very funny book. It was sort of a controversial book too, but it was a very funny book. And he at one point described cabinet officers as lords of distant parts of the empire who periodically would come to the White House and beg the White House staff for some attention and an audience with the president. That wasn't far from false. It was kind of true. Okay, cabinet secretaries repeatedly are pushed to the outskirts of policymaking, and a very big White House staff has developed to take over policymaking. The problem is that White House staff has no interaction with the people who actually do things, who actually implement policy. And that is left to the cabinet secretaries to try and get their word in if they think they've learned something valuable from their staff. One of the stories in the book is at a department called INS at the State Department. INS is a small department. I mean, it's probably, I think it's about 600, it's in the book, I can't remember, it's probably 600 people altogether, which, you know, in the scope of this federal government is bupkas. The INS got Iraq right. Not only did they get Iraq right, they wrote about it, they talked about it, they told people about it, they told Colin Powell about it, they told everybody who would listen about it. As I was putting that story together, it turned out that recently unclassified documents from Vietnam showed that, guess what? Way back in the 1960s, INS had gotten Vietnam right. They had written, they had said, oh, no, no, this is a disaster, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. At every part of this big government, which we spend lots of money on, there are people who actually know things. And the trick of the president is to figure out who they are and listen to them. As it is, presidents tend to look at the whole thing with horror. Republican presidents tend to think that the whole thing is just one big mess and they ought to get rid of it. Democratic presidents tend to think that all those people in the government are with them, right, and that everything's going to be all right. And in fact, what everybody's doing is they're ignoring it. So my first argument is for the building of capacity in a new White House to figure out the government that people have. My second argument is to create an early warning system in the White House that, in fact, looks systematically at the government for signs of trouble. Lots of people knew that they were cooking the books at the Veterans Administration. That was only a surprise to President Obama and his team. That was even passed from the Bush administration to the Obama administration in their transition briefings. There were GAO reports. There were lots of things that made you say, something's not right here. Keeping your ear to the ground, paying attention to this. You know, look, we're not going to avoid all failure, but we can decrease the probability of failure, which is really all any leader can hope to do, is just not screw up quite as much or quite as badly. And that can be helped with a president who's paying attention, who's organized his White House not around a continual series of message events, but who's organized his White House around, or her White House, around actual governing. The second aspect to this, I think, is a little bit more diffuse and a little bit more difficult, but it's also kind of timely. There was an old-fashioned way of nominating presidents. It had nothing to do with primaries. Primaries existed, nobody paid attention to them. Presidents were selected by party leadership. As a matter of fact, take that bad old term, superdelegates. Most of our presidents, from Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Kennedy, they were all nominated by superdelegates, okay? There were no primaries to speak of that had any meaning. Now, there were a lot of problems with that system, which is why it has gone away. But one of the advantages of that system was something we call peer review. Potential presidents were judged by their peers. They were judged by experienced men, because in those days it was usually men, so forgive me for saying men. They were judged by experienced men who knew something about government and something about politics. So let me tell you one little story that's in the book. Jack Kennedy had to convince Governor Lawrence of Pennsylvania that he could win the nomination and he could be president. And if you remember, Jack Kennedy was kind of a young guy, whippersnapper, and a lot of people didn't take him very seriously, particularly some of these crusty old guys running the Democratic Party. So Jack Kennedy had to prove himself in the Wisconsin, then the West Virginia primary, but mostly he had to just talk to Governor Lawrence and say, look, I really can do this. I want you to fast forward and imagine that conversation today. What would be similar? Well, they'd probably have cigars. Maybe they'd have cigars or electronic cigarettes or something. They'd certainly have some brown liquid in their glasses, right? And imagine Donald Trump sitting down with an experienced two-term governor of Pennsylvania who controls all the Republican governors and saying, I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to make Mexico pay for it. Now, the governor would say, what? What are you talking about? Okay, are you nuts? Okay, this doesn't seem at all real. And if Donald Trump couldn't say that this was real, he would probably not impress the governor very much, and he probably wouldn't get the delegates from that convention, from that state. What we've lost when we went from a nomination system that was an inside game to a totally outside game is we lost the element of peer review. For a while, we relied on the press to do that. See, we relied on reporters to ask hard follow-up questions. But frankly, they haven't been doing such a good job because they too are interested in ratings, etc. So they're interested more in a good show. They're not interested in stopping the whole show and saying, what is the nuclear triad? What is it? Something that Donald Trump didn't obviously know what it was. Now, we don't have to know what it is, believe me. Most people don't have to know what it is. President of the United States, you better know what it is, okay? It's maybe the most important thing in the protection of the country. So that's what we've lost. I don't know how exactly we get it back. I know we've lost it. I know we can't go back to the smoke-filled rooms. I mean, that's not going to happen. But we need to get that element of seriousness back into our politics, and that element of asking candidates, okay, that sounds like a good thing to do. Can you give us an idea how you're going to do it? And if we don't, and the stakes here are very high, if we don't, we will continue in a cycle that we've been in of increasing polarization, where people are continually disappointed in their president. People think, oh my goodness, this guy says this, and then he doesn't do it, okay? And that has created a downward cycle, and Americans' faith in their government is the worst that it's been in over half a century. And more people think that the country's going in the wrong direction than they have in many, many decades. So this is a really serious problem, and I think we have to get back to a point where politicians don't just talk, but they actually can deliver. And hopefully then the second part of this title, How They Can Succeed Again, will happen. So thank you very much, and let's have your questions or comments. Thank you.
Part of the president's work is the ceremonial part, which we really like. We like them to put on a performance. Nobody really asks them to deliver how you get to run an organization. You know, in England they have it right. The Queen does the ceremonial part. The work is done, whatever.
That's right.
Ronald Reagan had it right. He had the ceremonial part right. He really didn't care about running it. He left that. He fell asleep during the meetings, ate his jelly beans, but he could deliver a speech. And we loved him. So isn't it the voters who want it this way? I mean, they get upset when someone doesn't deliver.
That's right.
And as for the not delivering Obamacare, that was just stupid. I mean, any system, you test and you fail.
You test, right?
And nobody tested it, they went.
That's right.
So somebody failed there.
Well, and one of the reasons they didn't test the system, okay, is they were so afraid of Republican opposition that they didn't want to test it and have any failures in their tests get out. In other words, they were obsessed with message as opposed to reality, right? And that's one of the key stories as we've unpacked, and the historians I'm sure will unpack more of this. We are stuck with a system where the president has to be the symbolic head and also, as you said, be the practical person who is running the government. But the presidents are often overexposed these days. There's a book that I cite in here by Sam Cornell, which shows over time the number of speeches and the amount of travel that American presidents have done. And it goes straight up. Okay, the line goes straight up. In other words, Roosevelt didn't run around the country like this. Neither did Truman, neither did Eisenhower. Even Kennedy stayed relatively in one place. So this is a kind of modern phenomenon of our presidents thinking that they have to be everywhere all the time, always showing up, you know, always exercising the symbolic role. I don't diminish the symbolic role. I do think that's important. It's just that when you're not paying attention to the other things and the other things fail, then they really hurt a president's ability to either accomplish more things, which is what happened to Obama, or in the case of poor Jimmy Carter, I mean, he had an election coming up and he lost.
I'm missing the connection between Obama's messaging and his, like, why that's exclusive from, like, not also paying attention to government. Oh,
okay. What happened after they passed the law? Two things happened. The most important was that Obama gave implementation of his law to something I know you know well, called CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And CMS, again, all you have to know about this organization is that it had been in trouble for many years. In fact, there's something called the high risk list in the American government, and CMS had been on it every single year since it was formed. In other words, this was an organization that was having trouble doing the job it was supposed to do. Many people knew that. Obama and his staff did not. And they gave it to CMS, and CMS was simply did not have the basic organizational capacity to do the contracting correctly, the testing correctly, et cetera. And so it fits into some of my other stories where what presidents do is they think, okay, well, I just passed the law, or I just made this speech, now somebody out there in that big government is going to do it. And sometimes people in that big government are pretty smart and do things well, and sometimes they screw it up. When they screw it up, the public blames it on the president, you know, and I'm not saying that President Obama should have been writing code, okay? He should not have been writing code. And I'm not saying that President Jimmy Carter should have been flying the helicopters in the Tehran rescue mission. But they do need to know something about the capacity of the government that they're running to avoid trouble, or at least try to avoid trouble.
You have lots of stories, organizational banana peels, large and small. So I ask you just to imagine, in the incoming Clinton administration, highly scripted, secretive, walled off, paranoid, what kinds of banana peels will they see? Just from the way they are structured.
Yeah, that's not a good way to structure an administration, for sure. Okay, I totally agree with you. I think that the one thing that will counter that is that she herself has seen it all. And she's seen a lot of different parts of it, so, and not always successfully, right? I mean, but she got a good dose of what CMS was like back when it was called HCFA, when she tried to do health care. She had a good dose of what the State Department knows and doesn't know, what the military knows and doesn't know from being Secretary of State. So I think that while she will certainly have her leadership problems, as all of them do, I think that experience does help. I think one of the reasons, you know, look, Ronald Reagan, you know, he acted like a not very good president, but he had been the governor of California for 2 terms. Reagan ran a big state with a big bureaucracy. He had a wonderful avuncular public presence, but he really wasn't a total dodo, okay? Reagan really knew stuff, and in fact, I don't have any examples in my book from the Reagan administration or from the Bill Clinton administration. And I explain that to my readers as follows, which is while they both made mistakes, they both had their problems as presidents, they didn't have this kind of problem. And part of it was, and we've heard this said often in American politics, governors tend to make a little bit better presidents because governors are used to running large entities with a lot of moving pieces to them, etc. So, you know, I think she's got a good chance at being a good president. They all face their problems.
On your governor's point, since most or all of us live in Massachusetts, I'm really struck by the parallel between Deval Patrick's 8 years of great Zoring rhetoric and the electorate saying, okay, can we elect a governor who can actually run the government?
Run the government, right.
Switched over to Charlie Baker, and they couldn't be more opposite in some ways. And when you were writing this is all going on in Massachusetts, and how did you reflect on, or how did you think about how this affects governors as well?
Well, you know, I didn't think governors precisely, but I've always thought about mayors. And the reason is that mayors are that's the office in the United States where everybody understands what you do. And they understand, did you do it well, or am I going to punish you? Right? And of course, the classic example is the snowstorm, right? Where the mayor cannot get the city dug out from the snow. And the mayors who fail at that always take a pretty heavy political hit. Mayors do things that everybody understands, okay? And so there's a kind of immediate accountability for that local level, right? I mean, did you break the axle on your car because the pothole on Mass Ave was so big, right? I mean, that's the sort of thing that the local ones do. When you get to the presidency, it gets much more difficult and much more diffuse. With the exception of the military, the Social Security Administration, and the Internal Revenue Service, the federal government actually doesn't do much. What the federal government does is it gives money to states to do things, you see. So what you have is this, I used to tell my students at Harvard that think of the federal government as a great big ATM machine, okay? And it's just sending money all around. And people argue about the distribution of that money, okay? But a lot of times the people actually doing things with that money are not federal employees. Okay, so the federal government exists at a kind of distant level for most people. And that's why there's so much confusion over who's a good president, who isn't a good president. It's a harder thing to do. Mayors and to a certain extent governors, you can pretty much see, what's happening. Look at poor Governor Christie with that bridge problem, right? you don't have to have gone to Harvard and gotten a degree in the Gov department to figure out that something was really wrong on that bridge.
I love your concept of political peer review. Who do you think the candidates would be for each party? Had the peer review been in place in 2016?
Well, it wouldn't be Trump, okay? I mean, it wouldn't be Trump. I don't think it would have been Jeb Bush, because I think there was something to yesterday, because what the bosses used to do is the bosses used to evaluate on 2 tracks, right? What's this person like as a serious person, somebody who can govern, et cetera, and what's this person like politically? I think it might have been John Kasich, okay? I think if John Kasich was the nominee now, he'd be beating Hillary Clinton. So I think it might have been John Kasich. It might have been Chris Christie had all these problems, so that might have taken him out, even though I think he was very adept at both politics and government. On the Democratic side, that's a little harder because we had 2 very unusual candidates this side. But if you go back to 2008, it wouldn't have been Barack Obama, even if Barack Obama were white. So let's take race out of it for a minute, which of course in the old days was important. But even if Barack Obama had been white, they would have never picked somebody with that little governmental experience. They just didn't. And it wasn't, I don't want to overemphasize it. There weren't a bunch of wonky people, grading them, but they had a feel for who knew the game and who they could deal with. And they wanted to be able to deal with them. So let's say we brought back Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley, from the grave, and said to him, it took 18 months for President Obama to play golf with the Speaker of the House. Daley would have, what? What kind of president is that, right? I mean, that's the first thing you do, is try to get yourself a working relationship and an ability to negotiate in good faith.
They nominated Jack Kennedy, who had not much more experience than Barack Obama, and picked him over the quintessential politician of the
Lyndon Johnson. Absolutely.
Was the other candidate in the 1960 primary. So,
But again, remember, they make a political judgment too. Lyndon Johnson I have this wonderful clip that you can find on YouTube that I showed my students when I taught presidential elections here. A wonderful clip of Johnson and Kennedy speaking before the California delegation during the 1960 convention, because, you know, they had to go around at the last minute and make their pleas, right? And Lyndon Johnson just is awful. He's up there and he just goes on and on about the filibuster that he ran and how he stayed up all night, and Bill something, something, something. I mean, it was terrible. And then Kennedy comes up, and the whole audience brightens up, and he's making them laugh, and he kind of makes fun of Johnson, etc. So there was clearly a political talent that they were looking at there as well, and enough of the other political skill that obviously Kennedy passed muster. What Kennedy had to do, and this is just a little history lesson about this, Kennedy, in the old days, they used the primaries if they had to. And Kennedy had to run in the primaries to prove that that a Catholic could win Protestant votes. So he thought he could do that in Wisconsin. And he won Wisconsin. And the bosses, the Governor Lawrences of the world, said, no, Jack, you didn't convince us of anything. Because they looked then at the internals of the vote and said, you won Wisconsin because you got a great big Catholic vote that turned out and overwhelmed the Protestant vote. You didn't get Protestant votes. We're not convinced. So that's why he had to go to West Virginia. There weren't many Catholics in West Virginia, so he had to go to West Virginia, and he did win West Virginia, and that helped, you know, convince everybody. So remember, these people were looking at on two levels, and look, they didn't always make great choices. I mean, you know, they also nominated, you know, Herbert Hoover and you know, some people like this. So it wasn't always great, but there is that element that is missing in today's process.
If we can't go back to the good old boys club and today's process is broken, what's a palatable agreement you would imagine? You know, like what can we do now that would actually work?
Well, I think there's two things. I do think that the debates have been very good for both parties. I mean, I think the debates do test people, do let the voters know. I think, however, that the press has gotten pretty lazy and pretty sloppy because they're afraid to confront the candidates in these debates. And so they let them say things. I mean, this was an extreme year on this, but, you know, they let them say things that just don't, you know, are out of left field or right field, that just don't bear any relationship to reality. So I think the press, you know, we kind of thought, well, the press was going to do this role, and they really haven't. And so I think that that's something that we need to think about. How do you structure a debate so that you test not just what people believe, but can they actually do what they say they're going to do? Do they know enough to do that?
One of your recommendations was for staff at the White House to be able to understand what parts of the government is working. Wouldn't that argue for a permanent staff at the White House, another bureaucracy that transcends presidents?
Well, having worked in the White House myself, I can say that trust is pretty important. And if you had a permanent bureaucracy, there's no guarantee that the president would listen to them. You see, the people who get listened to, let me put it this way, the organization chart of a White House almost never tells you who's important. Okay, because who's important has to do with their longevity with the president himself or herself, levels of trust, etc. And usually those are the campaign people, and usually the campaign people are, you know, they're good at communicating. What they're good at is the speech. They're good at, you know, putting Hillary Clinton up in a white suit to remind us of the suffragettes and, you know, all this great, wonderful symbolism, right, that we saw. That's what they're good at, okay? And they tend to still have the president's ear for some time. So the president needs to create a counterbalance, but he would need to create them from among his own people, or at least from among his own partisans. Because, you know, there's plenty of, you know, GAO is just a, you know, does nothing but nonpartisan objective analysis all the time. And how many presidents ever read a GAO report? You know, they don't. They just go into the ether. Congressional Research Service. I mean, we have these civil servant, nonpartisan entities, but they don't break through.
So, this gentleman mentioned the media. Do you think that with a lot of growing frustration over the media's inability to cover more policy specifics, and this year with this sort of amalgamation of that and Trump, do you think that we'll get a shift in the media being more sort of wonkish and less about the rhetoric?
That's an interesting question. I am not quite sure. Okay, I mean, one of the weird things that happened with Trump was Trump drove numbers for newspapers, websites, television, etc. And what happened is that the reporters and the editors then encouraged that because they wanted to drive their own numbers. We'll see what happens when we return, hopefully we will, to a more normal kind of election than this one was. The other thing we might see is we might see political parties starting to take back some control over their nomination process. There was palpable unhappiness at the Cleveland Convention over the fact that Republicans didn't consider Donald Trump a Republican. And in fact, there were really two conventions. There was Monday and Tuesday where you had people like Paul Ryan and Chris Christie giving the classic Republican freedom, small government, small business, lack of intervention. I mean, a very powerful and very American message on Monday and Tuesday. And then you had on Wednesday and Thursday, you had the Trump convention, which was kind of, I mean, I liked Ivanka's, you know, speech about working mothers and stuff like that, but frankly, Hillary Clinton could have given that speech. So that was kind of all muddled. And there's a lot of unhappiness in the Republican Party especially about that. And even in the Democratic Party. I mean, you know, there were people with long memories who, you know, remembered that Bernie Sanders worked against Democrats from time to time. There was one Bernie delegate from Massachusetts sitting next to me who didn't know who John Lewis was. You know, John Lewis was the civil rights leader who marched with Martin Luther King and who was probably the closest leader to King. And it was kind of like oh, you really haven't been part of the historiography of this party. So, you know, I think the parties may step back and figure out how do we take a little bit more control over this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
There were laws against foreign languages, and particularly German language, throughout the states in that time. It was considered more patriotic to speak American, and I hope this resonates with some things that are happening today. But Iowa went further than anyone. Their governor, Governor Harding, passed a law called the Babel Proclamation, which is a great name for a law that was absolutely terrible.